So we finally have a new game release that's actually worth a budget benchmarking video. It's been like 2 months now, which is pretty crazy. As you can tell from the title, today we're going to be benchmarking the new Resident Evil 2 with 8 very popular budget graphics cards. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be benchmarking the new Resident Evil 2 with 8 budget graphics cards and with the system that you would actually pair with one of these GPUs. And if you're new here and you want to see more benchmarking or PC building videos, then hit that subscribe button down below and also that notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's start benchmarking. So just like all of my other benchmarking videos, I like to give a quick introduction of the cards in our testing platform, but if you're only interested in seeing the actual benchmarks, then feel free to skip to this time frame in the video. If not, then yeah, for our quick card introduction, I'm going to be benchmarking the game with 8 different cards, and I decided to eliminate what I would consider mid-tier cards and only focus on the budget ones. These GPUs are the GTX 660 Ti, GTX 750 Ti, GTX 960, GT 1030, GTX 1050 Ti, the AMD HD 7850, R7 360, and finally the RX 460. Now obviously there's other graphics cards on the planet right now. These are just what I have in the studio, and these are all popular here in 2019, especially after my HD 7850 videos. But if you want to see more of the mid-end cards like the 1060 or the 970, then please let me know down in the comment section. Moving on to our testing platform, we're rocking our trusty Dell Optiplex because this is a system that you can find for around $100 here in the US, and it's a system that you would actually pair with these GPUs. This Optiplex is rocking an i5 3470 clocked at 3.6 GHz, 8 GB of DDR3 RAM, a 500 watt power supply, and I have Resident Evil 2 installed on a 7200 RPM Seagate Barracuda HDD. And before getting into the actual benchmarks, I just want to remind you guys that the settings that you're about to see for each card are the settings that I would personally play at if I was using one of these cards, and I always try to aim for around that 50 to 60 FPS mark. And also, just so you guys know, to keep the benchmarks as consistent as possible, I found this level early on in the game that I used for my benchmarking run with every single card. When running around in a few circles, I found this was a perfect level because there's a lot of textures moving with the flames on the cars, and the zombies were always moving depending on how close I got to them, so it wasn't a static benchmark run or anything. Always keep in mind that your frame rates will definitely vary depending on the maps and the levels. And finally, with all that out of the way, here's a chart showing off what every card can do with the exact same settings, 1080p and medium. I'm about to dive into what specific settings that I would use for each card after this, but if you wanted to see how all of these cards compare, then here you go. So the first card up was the GTX 660 Ti. Make sure you check out my recent videos about this card because it's still kicking here in 2019, and here in 1080p, I was actually able to crank it up to high settings and still average 56 frames per second. Next up was the GTX 750 Ti. This one is always battling back and forth with the 660 Ti in my benchmarking videos, and here in 1080p, I actually had to drop it down to medium to get above our target 50 FPS mark, so it's definitely running a bit slower than our 660 Ti for this title. The GTX 960 followed up next, and for this card, I was actually able to pretty much max out the settings at 1080p, but I kept the anti-aliasing at TAA, and here I was still able to maintain above our target 60 FPS mark. Definitely impressive if you ask me. Following that, we have our super budget GT 1030. Didn't have as much luck with this one though, as I was only able to put the settings at 1080p and low for a 43 FPS average. I didn't quite hit our 60 FPS target, but honestly, as you can see from the 1% and 0.1% lows, it was still pretty smooth and playable. And finally, our last NVIDIA card for today, the GTX 1050 Ti followed up next, and here with max settings like the 960, this card did way better by averaging 79 FPS. This result was pretty interesting because the 960 actually beat the 1050 Ti in the previous chart's medium settings, but because of that extra 2GB of VRAM, the 1050 Ti was able to crush the 960 with the max settings. And with that, we move on to our few AMD cards that I have laying around the studio, the first one being the HD 7850, and in 1080p medium settings, just like the chart earlier, I was able to average a smooth 55 FPS. Next up was the R7 360, also just made a dedicated video on this one a few months ago by the way, and for this card I actually had to drop the settings to 1080p and low and average just a frame under our target 50 FPS average mark. And finally, the last card up today is the RX 460, and in 1080p I was able to get the settings up to high and still average an impressive 69 frames per second. Obviously from all of these results, I think it's safe to say that this game is pretty optimized right out of the box. Well, that wraps up my Resident Evil 2 benchmarking video with 8 budget graphics cards. Please stop making me benchmark horror games in the future. Now feel free to head on over to one of these 2 videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button because later this week I'm benchmarking a new CPU. You don't want to miss that video.